Hey, this is Cameron O'Hearn with Mass of the Ages, and today I'm bringing you an incredible discussion. I traveled in time. I already heard the discussion, and it was incredible, and I can't wait to bring it to you. Between Alex O'Connor and Father Gregory Pine, they talk about hell, they talk about the hiddenness of God, the fall of Adam and Eve, and it leaves us with a lot of compelling questions and insightful answers. So I hope you enjoy it.
Well, hello. My name is Father Gregory Pine.
Father Gregory Pine. Alex.
Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I didn't know if that was a behold or if that was an extending handshake.
Perhaps it's both.
All right.
It can function as both. Anyway, I suppose it depends on how they edit it. So this is the first time we've met.
Yep.
And I must confess to not knowing all that much about you. Usually, if I know I'm going to be having a conversation with somebody, I'll spend a few days looking at their work and listening to some of their prior materials. But we are in Washington, D.C., so I've just been sort of gallivanting around the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial like a real tourist. So I'm excited to get to know you on camera.
Yeah.
So
Same. I think I can say something similar insofar as I think I saw a thumbnail of a debate that you had with Bishop Barron. And then, as is the case in the YouTube React to Things cottage industry, I think I saw subsequent thumbnails of people who are reacting to the debate or unpacking the debate. And then, yeah, seen things come up since then. Were you on Pints? Did you go on a debate on Pints?
yes, once actually, with Trent Horn.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Trent and I had a debate about, I think it was just God's existence, and it was essentially the principle of sufficient reason and the problem of evil being sort of thrown in at each other and trying to meet in the middle somewhere. I did do that.
Okay.
And
Do you typically find debate fruitful?
depends on what you mean. I think that a lot of the time debate amounts essentially to theatre, and that's fine if that's what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with a bit of entertainment, but a lot of the time that is what it is. It depends on the person that you're speaking to. Other times it can be a bit more serious, but I don't find that it's fruitful in the sense of, I mean, everybody knows you're not going to convince the person who you're speaking to. Although I did think that if I were to ever convert to Christianity, for instance, something big like that, I think the way that I'd reveal it is by agreeing to a debate and then getting up to the podium for my opening statement and going, you know what? Yeah, fair enough. I think you're right. It's ludicrous to think that might happen, but generally people say you're doing it for the audience. Even in that case, I think what debates can provide is something like a useful showcase of arguments. It's sort of a summary of a position. They get to consider arguments they might not have heard before, and they go home with something to think about, and that's what they're for. And in that regard, they're incredibly successful. I wouldn't be thinking about this stuff if I hadn't stumbled across the new atheist debates of the sort of mid-noughties. I wouldn't be here doing this. So they have that effect, I think. But I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I sincerely don't know because I've only done a couple of them, or a few of them, I suppose. One of which was fruitful. It was with a Catholic who was concerning the morality of lying. And I found that the preparation for it was fruitful for me. Sussing out the arguments with somebody who had chops was also fruitful for me. And I hope fruitful for the audience too. But I just don't have access to them insofar as you just don't know. I typically don't read comments because I'm too fragile. And then I had two debates with atheists or agnostics. And I wouldn't say that I'm especially gifted at the kind of like analytic philosophical tradition or following the argumentation as it's laid out by many practitioners thereof. And so I like feel this kind of keen sense of drift, like I don't know what the existential stakes are. And as a result of which I feel myself kind of like growing weary because it seems like a formal exercise. And maybe that's intellectual laziness, or it could be a kind of, I don't know, it could be something else. But I'm just trying to figure out if I'm in for it.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I also don't know how much exposure you had to the more famous debates, like the sort of the new atheist stuff, the Dawkins and Craig, the Hitchens and Craig, the Dawkins and Lennox, these kind of things. I don't know if you've spent much time watching these and what you make of them. They're interesting and they're entertaining and they do get people thinking about it, but it's hard to say whether they're effective or not. I do know, at any rate, that the conversational format, generally speaking, is superior in that regard, which hopefully we will allow that to inform our discussion today, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. We've been brought together. I should say, people listening might not know, my name is Alex O'Connor. I'm a YouTuber. I host a podcast called Within Reason. That's about it. And we were sort of asked to sit down today to talk about divine hiddenness. And I think the reason for that is that somewhat recently I've been making a bit of a song and dance about it. It's, in my view, kind of a version of the problem of evil. If God, then why bad stuff?
Yeah.
But it's a very particular kind of bad stuff. And something that I think is perhaps one of the principal emotional reasons for people not believing in God. I think there's a syllogistic argument that you can make out of it too, as is most famously been done by J.L. Schellenberg, but just on an experiential level, if you ask somebody why they don't believe in God, if they've thought about the arguments quite a lot, they might still tell you that it's got something to do with evil and maybe something to do with hiddenness. And if you ask somebody who has absolutely no interaction with the arguments and the debates, then they might tell you that it's got something to do with evil and something to do with hiddenness. And so I think it's worth addressing, in other words.
Yeah. No, I think in approaching the problem, I'm convinced on the one hand that like basic commitment, sacred scripture is inspired. One line that is pertinent to the conversation from sacred scripture is 1 Timothy 2:4, God desires that all be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. So it seems like a basic Christian commitment is the availability of the gospel, the availability of a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ to all. And it's not something that's merely for the wise or the smart or the advanced or the proficient. It's for everybody, and not by way of patronization or condescension as a kind of, intellectual way by which to pat people on the head and say, like, you can do it too. But in a robust sense, it has to be. And with that being so, then you have to be able to account for a variety of factors or a variety of proofs, so-called. And what I mean by that is that it's something that can be mediated, personally, familiarly. That's a difficult adverb to say. Socially, politically, like it's something that should be shot through the human experience, and that it ought to register at different points, because it ought to be a kind of encompassing vision rather than something laid up in the heavens or squirreled away in a corner that only the very disciplined or only the very advanced can access. And so, yeah, I mean, just at that kind of basic level, or from that vantage, there's a real appeal to the argument insofar as like it takes existential hold of me, because it's not, at least not in my experience of the 21st century, not discounting my experience of the 20th century, it just wasn't that long. I can see how people would have difficulty with that insofar as all of those intermediate institutions aren't especially forthcoming with the knowledge of God.
Well, perhaps it would be useful to spell this out a little bit. Like, what are we really talking about here? As you say, Scripture seems to sort of be sprinklings of indications that if there is a God who loves us and wants to come to know us and has the power to do essentially anything that he wants to, there's a big question mark over the fact that he seems not only to not reveal himself to everybody who wants to find him, but also there seems to be a problem in the statistical arrangement of this belief. That is, if you're born in certain parts of the world, you're considerably more likely to be at least a nominal Christian than if you were born somewhere else. And I think this deserves explaining too. An example that I'd given in a debate with Jonathan McLatchie, where I pressed the point of divine hiddenness, comes from Stephen Mateson, who points out that Thailand is 90-something% Buddhist, and therefore 90-something% atheistic. You look at the population of Rwanda, and the opposite will be true. You'll have a majority theistic population. And the question is, how do we explain this? Is it the case that the Thai are just statistically, just by their nature, somehow more resistant to the word of God? Seems unlikely to me. And if so, there'd still be a question as to why they sort of are of such a constitution that makes them that way. Okay, so explanation 2 might be that God has some reason to hide himself disproportionately more from the Thai than from somebody living in Massachusetts. Again, that seems bizarre to me. It's not logically impossible, but I don't think that's an explanation that anybody would really take seriously. A third option is, of course, that religion is a man-made sociological phenomenon, and therefore we would expect to find that the beliefs essentially reflect the geography and sociology of the people who believe them. That to me seems to be the best explanation of that geographical spread. When you account for the fact that we're talking about, or when you need to account for the fact that we're talking about a God who seems to have a proactive desire to bring people to come to know him, I think the problem compounds.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose prima facie, there are a couple of considerations that crop up, on my radar. One of which is the power of God, and then the attendant quote unquote responsibility of God, and the related doctrine of creation and how that factors in. And then another would be the related doctrine of agency, both the agency of God and then the agency of creatures, which would be like a participated or limited expression of agency. So maybe just to talk about the first, I think that in some of these conversations, I'm made nervous by a description of God such that he becomes a kind of optimizing, maximizing machine, because I think it's a risk to import that type of logic in a way, or like to map that logic onto divine agency. I'm not saying that you're doing this, but I'm just saying I often hear it lurking in the background or in the shadows, because there are some Christians who have made arguments to the effect that God brings about the best possible world, taking into account all the pertinent material circumstances. You might lodge a Buddhist objection and say, isn't it God's responsibility to limit suffering? Well, insofar as there's a material world, it seems like, one is going to build itself up by the diminishment of another, like law of conservation of matter, just played out at different levels of the created world. But insofar as you're committed to a hierarchically or like a stratified expression of creation, then it seems like you're going to admit for the possibility of matter. You're going to admit for the possibility of at least physical evil, and then animal suffering. That's a whole other question. But that in that setting, like a lot of people want to say that all the pertinent factors being taken into account because God is the supercomputer beyond all supercomputers, that what you have is the best possible arrangement. But that's not a traditional Christian commitment. And like St. Thomas will say, for instance, this is Prima Pars, question 25, Article 6, he says no. Like, sacred scripture just says no. So God is motivated by his glory in the sense that God chooses on account of his own goodness. And then what we see in creation are various limited expressions or kind of constrained expressions of his goodness. So God, in knowing himself, knows all of the ways in which his divine life can be participated by creatures. He weds his will to some of those things, and he wills that they be and that they act in accord with their nature. And, we can imagine a universe better than the present one. Like I have a bad Casio watch. I was telling you that I lived in Switzerland for the past 3 years, so this is my Swiss watch, but I got it at an Aldi, so I suppose it probably came from somewhere else. But it continues to reset itself like every 3 days, which is frustrating because I'm continually resetting it while walking down the stairwell, thus endangering my footing. So like a watch that would be part of a better world and thus more approximate to a best possible. So maybe, I don't know. That's kind of, I don't know if it's so much as of an allergy as it is of like a sensitivity, but I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I'm suspicious of the idea of a best possible world, especially when talking about one with divine authorship, because it seems as though there's no intrinsic maximum here. There's always something that can be somehow improved, even if it's just like the presence of more goods. You can just create a whole other planet Earth somewhere in the universe that's untouchable by the other. They'll never interact with each other. And you can keep doing this. You can keep making the universe bigger. There'll always be, if that's the case, a better possible world. And so there is no such thing as the best possible world. And so to complain that we're not in the best possible world is, I think, a mistake, because how could we be if there is no such thing? that does leave us with a sort of strange image of God almost arbitrarily picking somewhere in the middle of, I mean, there's not even a middle. We're talking about a sort of potentially infinite increase in goods. And so just sort of arbitrarily picking a stopping point and saying, that'll do it. It doesn't seem to me what's going on. Maybe this talk of possible worlds is the wrong way to think about it altogether. But the problem remains that God, in the Christian understanding, is a personal God whose aim and reason for creating the universe is to allow human beings, some would say coerce human beings, into a relationship with him. If that's the goal, if that's the desire, then it seems strange to me that some people are given an easy ride in this respect. They either get some form of religious experience, perhaps they receive a prophecy, perhaps they even get to meet the risen Christ himself. But not me, not my friends, not people that I know, probably not yourself. I don't know, you may have had a religious experience in your life, but I'm not sure that you've met Jesus and you know the way in which I mean that. In which case, there seems to be a sort of crude element of favoritism going on. If not favoritism, then experiences granted to others that if granted to me would allow me to be in a position or compel me to be in a position to inherit eternal life that I'm not receiving through no fault of my own. And yet this could be the deciding factor as to my eternal fate. This seems unfair for a start, and that's one of the atheists' main gripes, is unfairness. This seems unfair. It's unfair that people suffer. It's unfair that religious belief is scattered in predictable ways, and I'm not among the favored, the elect. This is, I think, probably the principal emotion behind the power of this argument and why people so often refer to it, is that it seems unfair. And if God is anything, it seems he must be fair. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with that. I imagine that you would agree that God would be fair, but that, I think, puts you in a position of having to defend the fairness, or having to believe that there is, in principle, a defense of the fairness of the kind of distribution that I've described.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that God is fair. Insofar as, our paradigm for fairness is based on a human expression of justice.
Yeah.
And in justice, you're rendering to another what is his due, but you're doing so according to a standard of equality, which equality can't really be grounded in our relationship to God. And that doesn't mean to say that he floats free of all morality. It's just that he is subsisting, morality in a certain sense, insofar as I would say that there's a non-parallelism between God's relationship to us and our relationship to God. And I think that's part of, there are a lot of interrelated things that I'm going to get too excited about and talk too fast about. Deep breath. So with respect to the doctrine of creation, I think that one, the relation of creation, and then the, as it were, goal of creation. And here I'm relying on revelation. I'm not smart enough to figure this out. So that's a kind of dependence of all things upon God. And that's the heart of the matter, that everything that is by God's gift. And so this note of gratuity enters at the outset, so that none of us are due anything, because it could have been otherwise and it could not have been. And as a result of which, what we have come to possess in time is God's gift, but that it's earmarked for glory, or that it's earmarked for a return to God. And I think part of the complexity and subtlety of the divine plan is, regardless of the gifts that are apportioned in the natural order, that there are further gifts in store in the supernatural order, which are not directly correlated with those of the natural order. So like, for instance, Saint Therese of Lisieux, who lived in the late 19th century, she dies of tuberculosis at the age of 24, but she has these wild insights into the divine mercy, or these wild insights into the divine condescension, which in a certain sense catapult her beyond the limitations of body and soul, while still retaining a kind of organic connection with her personality and with her history. And so I think that God he's bringing about a certain differentiation in creation, because he's not motivated by a bland equality, because in a certain sense, and I don't pretend to know the mind of God, but in a certain sense, he says to himself, in the differentiation of creation, my divine life, which is, ineffable, the depths of which are unsoundable, stands a better chance at captivating or capturing the attention of creatures, because on account of the fact that I am infinite, a kind of wellspring of divine abundance. No one created thing can express that sufficiently. And so he expends himself in creation, saying it differently, with the intent that both in its being and acting and in the ultimate orientation of its being and acting to God, that you see both in the creature and in the ecosystematic harmony of the creatures taken as a whole or taken as a universe, right? Something more that God, as it were, hides both in the things and then in their relations as a way by which to afford us further opportunities for noticing. But I've been talking too long.
Well, I want to understand the relevance of this to the experience of saying, look, I'm somebody who maybe I used to be a new atheist saying that God is some celestial dictator. And maybe he is a celestial dictator, but I think maybe the celestial part sort of undermines the badness of the dictator part. Who knows? But, you shake that off and you say, okay, look, religion isn't all evil. Heaven isn't some kind of North Korea. It's actually a quite pleasurable sounding experience. If there are such things as sort of moral truths, then I want to apprehend and follow them. And I want to worship that which deserves to be worshipped. And I want to see my family and friends again. The whole works. I'm just not convinced. I just don't think it's true. I've listened to arguments and maybe I've had an irrational response to them, but I've tried my best. And, if I'm limited only by my cognitive capacity, then I can hardly be blamed for that. Maybe I should have tried harder in school, but that seems like a quite loose basis on which to balance my soul for eternity. And I think that in itself would be something of a problem of evil, one of the many problems of evil. Okay, so here's the situation that I'm in, and this is the situation that many people are in. And it may not be the case that I'm truly seeking properly. It may be that I'm what Schellenberg has called a resistant non-believer. That is, your person who sort of has some kind of proactive defensiveness. And this is certainly true of many people, but so long as there is a single example, it doesn't have to be me, of somebody who sincerely seeks but doesn't find an answer, then what I'm looking for, I suppose, is either an explanation for that, an explanation of that experience, some kind of second order explanation which makes that not a problem to worry about, or itself what I'm doing wrong so as not to experience that. A question that I often ask is what you would do if you woke up tomorrow, sort of in my mind, as it were, you just found yourself convinced that the arguments don't run anymore, in the way that you've heard about conspiracy theories that the moon landing was fake, but you just you intuitively think it's ridiculous. And even if you start to look into them a bit, you think, no, there's no way these are true. And if somehow the eternity of your soul was predicated upon you accepting that the moon landing didn't occur. And I'm not trying to say that the arguments for God are of the same caliber, but by analogy, something that, look, arguments do exist, and they're discussed ad nauseum on the internet. But when you listen to them, you don't get to choose not to be convinced by them. You're just not. If that's the case, I ask, if you found yourself in that situation, what would you change? What is it, in other words, that I might be doing wrong?
Yeah. I suspect I probably agree with you on the paper-thin quality of human volition. I think that in past generations, human volition has been described as something Herculean or colossal, and I just don't think that's really tenable. I think more often it's a matter of we're dealt a hand, and then we're asked to play the hand. The rules of the game are somewhat simple, not overly complex, but that we can choose to play the hand, even if it seems like a losing hand. We can play it with a kind of, whimsy or panache. And I think that that's largely what freedom amounts to. So I'm not saying that everyone has opinions which they find to be perfectly malleable or revisable. Like, for instance, there's just the fact of human investment. Think of like a Protestant pastor who is thinking about becoming Catholic. That's his livelihood, And you might say perhaps it's better not to involve oneself, like by way of livelihood, in a thing that you might decouple yourself from in subsequent, months or years. But that's not humane. We all do that. We all hitch our wagon to whatever it is. So I think that, one thing I would say is this. with respect to our rank in creation, and then with respect to differentiation amongst human beings, I would say that we're called to live this life. So not the life of rocks or of plants or of animals or of angels, but of men. And so, like when St. Thomas, for instance, describes the movement proper to each, echelon or rank, he'll say God, makes no movements. Insofar as movement for him, is an expression of coming to be. He says angels, they come to their end by one movement, whereas men come to their end by many movements. So I think that there can be a kind of tendency to falsify our human experience by focusing on certain moments of it or even like tranches of it, when truth be told, it's over the course, right? It's discursive, it's diachronic. And I think that we have two modes in which we operate, the living of our lives and then the interpreting of our lives. Some people might want to break that into further modes still. But I think that we learn to live our lives well, and we also learn to interpret our lives well. And as time passes, provided we're doing so sincerely, I would add in Christian context, by the grace of God, we get better at interpreting our lives. So like, for instance, if you had asked me in 2010, like, why did you become a Dominican friar? I would have told you like a hoorah story. It would have sounded like an army recruitment story. And you'd be like, that's precious. 13 years in, like I'm not utterly ground down, but I have had to suffer more for it. And as a result of which, the story that I'm going to tell you is different. And that doesn't mean that the story that I told you 13 years ago was necessarily false. It was, and nor was it just wholly perspectival. It's like I can't relate to myself back then. No, there's continuity, there's narrative continuity. But I would say that it's deeper, it's subtler, and I've picked out certain hues on the palette which I didn't perceive earlier, in part because of the way that life seasons your experience or kind of draws out the flavor of your experience. And so I think too, like for you now, that's probably, I mean, like, I don't want to make it too terribly personal because then it just becomes somewhat inextricable, But I also think that like patience, not just in the mere, the virtue that is commended to us by our schoolroom nannies, but patience in the sense of, like patio or pottery, like to suffer life well, not to be dramatic about it, but like a lot of life is endurance. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about the virtue of courage, he says there are two principal parts, the attack dimension and the endure dimension. He says the endure dimension is the principal part because life is hard, in effect, and because we need to bear up. And he breaks it out into two further pieces, which are patience and perseverance. Patience, which bears up under sadness, which I would say is one of the principal obstacles of living in the 21st century, and then perseverance, which sees it through to the end. So I think that there's something to the time-bound nature of our lives and God, his revelation interfacing with the time-bound nature of our lives, which forces us to kind of undergo it or to, like recognize and receive it with a certain patience.
Okay, in the context of what I'm talking about, that is the evil, if God does exist, seemingly, or the sort of ostensible, apparent evil of people being withheld from communion with him.
Yeah.
In the context of speaking about that, taking a more holistic approach to a person's life might be helpful, but there are still, I think, quite jarring problems with this. For example, I presume you believe in libertarian free will.
What the thing that I hold for antedates like the distinctions in which we currently traffic,
Sure,
and so I'm just a troll.
human beings get to
Choose stuff.
choose stuff.
Yeah.
And so perhaps it's the case that I'm on some kind of grand theological journey. And that is that maybe when I turn 45, I'm going to see my sort of waterfall split into 3 streams and fall to my knees and accept Christ. Problematically, Cameron sat over there has libertarian free will. He could choose to stand up and stab me in the throat and kill me now.
Yeah.
I would die. I would come before God and I would fall short. And I wouldn't have accepted the sacrifice of Jesus. If I am being used in some kind of, well, I shouldn't say used, if I'm part of some kind of grand theological journey, is the way I worded it, this can be cut short by another human being's actions and presumably, therefore, also cut off the road to redemption. Now, some people have suggested to me when I pointed this out that, well, okay, because people sometimes say to me that it's a good job I'm an atheist because when I finally convert to Christianity, I'll provide such a great story for people to look to. It would be some kind of road to Damascus-esque, narrative that people can refer to. Fine. Firstly, I feel like I'm being sort of used as a bit of a pawn.
Yeah.
But secondly, if that is the case, this can be cut short by another human being.
Yeah.
And sometimes people then say to me, well, if that were to happen, God would know what you would have done. they take a sort of Molinist view or something. They say, well, look, of course, if you die now, you're not making it to heaven. But God knows that if you would have stayed alive, that's what you would have done. And so you get to heaven on that account. If that's the case, then I don't see the point in this veil of tears altogether, because there's no point in running the exam if God already knows what everybody's going to get, if you know what I mean. So I'm not sure if what you were saying was a direct response to my point that people live with essentially the suffering of this privation of communion with God. Even looking at it as a journey, even if I look at it as something that could potentially develop over time, this is something that can be trivially cut short by another human being's actions. All of this put together just ascribes an arbitrariness and triviality to the conditions under which my eternal soul either receives this unimaginably pleasurable communion with goodness itself, or whatever your sort of doctrine of the afterlife for those who are not so lucky is. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you're an annihilationist. Even that, compared to the infinite goodness of communion with God, is, a sort of infinitely bad outcome. These problems, people have syllogized them. They've sort of been a bit analytical about it. They've done premise, conclusion. But can you feel the arbitrariness, the triviality of what I'm talking about here?
Yeah.
And so if I were you in a situation of thinking, okay, there are lots of people on planet Earth who are seeking very, very desperately, and they're not finding God, but I've got a relationship with him, I'd say lucky me. And you probably do say lucky me, but lucky you is unlucky me, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think needs to be accounted for.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think so like a couple of speculative backstops, and then maybe some more practical or existential things to advance, I suppose. So the one would be that this vision, the hierarchical nature of creation, or the differentiated nature of creation, and also differentiation within the ranks, like our human rank, it pertains to the wisdom of God as to see it through. So like taking an example, from Revelation, Catholics believe in a doctrine of predilection, namely that God loves everyone the same, but that he loves some people in a certain sense more than others, insofar as he accords them greater goods. So prima pars question 20, article 3, it's scandalous, but it's also somewhat beautiful seen from a particular angle, insofar as the point of the differentiation of the goods accorded to those who occupy the rank of human is for like an organic end, insofar as he describes it in the context of the mystical body of Christ. So it's not like, it's not so much better and worse as it is like heart and lungs. Now, mind you, you're going to look at the thing and you're going to see the person who was born blind and club-footed and, with all sorts of sufferings, and you're going to say, I'm sorry, heart and lungs, this is decidedly better and worse. And yet, and this is where I think that, a defense sometimes works better than a straight theodicy, insofar as you can tell a story of that person's life, not in every case, obviously, but in some cases, whereby God will use even that, not in the sense that God visited this thing because we have sufficient material conditions whereby to account for the fact that nature fails, it obtains always or for the most part, and that God, entrusting creation to a certain kind of set of conditions, as it were, admits for this possibility, but in light of a glory that lies in store, without chewing up and spitting out those who are involved in it as if they were mere pawns. So like, on the one hand, you've got this doctrine of predilection, so differentiation in the goods given, but then on the other hand, you have it in a personalistic whole, the idea that it's for the other. So like the Blessed Virgin Mary, for instance, I believe that God loves her most of those who are not God. And I don't begrudge her that, in part because it's glorious, and it's like something to behold, and in part because she's my mother. And, like not to get like touchy-feely about it, but I know that in a certain sense, the graces accorded to her are also graces given to me, insofar as she mediates them with some facility and with some tenderness, and I've encountered that in my life, and that can be part of a story. But that if this is from the unsearchable depths of the wisdom of God, in light of predilection, in such a way as to, like account for what we deal with here. Like we're never going to get to the bottom of it, but that by continuing to ask the question, right, we can get a hint of it, or we can get a kind of indication of it. I'll stop there.
I'm wondering how this consideration functions as a response to this. I think the problem is quite specific.
Okay.
That is, if there's a God who wants to come to know me,
Yeah.
and I want to come to know him,
Yeah.
and he has the power to bring about the conditions that he knows would lead to my conversion,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm proactively seeking those to the best of my ability, and even if it's not me, somebody else might be doing this, and they don't find him, I can sort of understand the idea that God might love Mary more than another human being. God might love you more than me more than you,
Yeah.
who knows? But the question I think that I'm wanting to get to the bottom of is, why are there some people who seem completely excommunicated in that they reach out and just can't find?
Yeah. So I'd say some things are beyond their control, but some things are also within their control. And so, again, Catholic dogma, it's been pronounced upon, which I take for a kind of epistemological backstop, that if one goes to heaven, it's by God's predestinating grace. If one goes to hell, it's because he has freely rejected that. So there's at least some way in which it can be said that by an exercise of free will, a grace which was offered was rejected. And so it's not necessarily like the grace of justification, but the Catholic teaching is that graces are kind of daisy chained together.
Yeah.
Right? So they're, if you want to...
I wanted to ask what your view of hell is, not in too much detail. I just want to know what we're talking about here when you talk about hell.
The absence of God. So God continues to be present by essence, presence, and power, in the sense that God continues to give being and agency, but one is entirely distant from the life of grace and has foreclosed on the possibility of the life of grace.
And
so
do you think this is a sort of a form of suffering? Do you think it's a sort of conscious torment, not of the kind of flames and brimstone, but a consciously endured suffering?
I think it is. Yeah, I'm not an annihilationist.
And for eternity?
I do.
Okay. So there was something I wanted to ask about when you were talking about people freely rejecting this gift. Do you think, as I do, that if it is true that this place, hell, exists, and that you somehow know you're going there and know the means to escape it, but choose not to do that anyway, that you are almost necessarily acting irrationally?
Yes. I mean, insofar as all sin is contrary to right reason, I think there's a kind of irrationality at the heart of it.
So my issue with this is that I think the only reason why somebody could possibly make that decision is if they either don't fully understand the situation or aren't convinced that it's true. Reason being that I think if you showed somebody hell and they knew that it existed, they knew with 100% certainty that it existed, and they knew that the way to avoid this is to, throw your life on Christ. People might struggle to varying degrees, but I don't even know if it would be possible for a person to not choose to at least try to do that. Now, you might want to say, Satan chose to fall away from God even though he had full knowledge. I mean, this is a poetic story, but I don't know if such a person could actually exist in reality. And that's because I think that what we're dealing with is essentially a form of threat, although I know you're not going to want to sort of view it in those terms, but there's some philosophical literature on the difference between an offer and a threat, and it's actually quite difficult to pull apart. Like, you can phrase it as, I'm going to offer you $1 million a year more to change your job, and that sounds like an offer, but it also kind of sounds like saying, there's a way of sort of thinking it in your mind of like, well, if you don't do this thing, then I'm going to sort of I'm going to prevent you from having $1 million that you otherwise could have had. It seems like you're almost being threatened. Now, there are various ways to get around this, but the literature is that I remember having read at university, it was far more like surprising in terms of the responses it has to the obvious answers that might spring to mind. At any rate, it seems to me a bit like something like that's going on, where this is, it's not just a good offer, it's goodness. You're being offered goodness. And if a person fully apprehends that that's what's on offer, I think it's impossible to rationally choose to reject it. And what that means is that the only people who can reject that, in my view, are people who are acting irrationally. And generally when sort of somebody's rationality goes wrong, it's not exactly their fault. In fact, that's kind of like what irrationality is. It's like the reasoning faculty has gone wrong. You know, it's not like you've reasoned it and you've got it rationally correct, you just choose not to. Irrationality means that hasn't happened. Otherwise, I think that somebody must just not be convinced that this is actually the case. In either case, I don't think it's fair that somebody can be sent to hell, if you see what I'm saying. I wonder if you have any reflections on that, in other words.
Yeah. So a couple initial thoughts are, with respect to the things that you cannot but choose or choose against, in the Catholic tradition, there's just one. It's the vision of God, like in his being, as it were, or in his essence. But everything else, on account of the fact that the evil or the good that it proffers is limited, leaves you free, insofar as you're free to see it from various vantages or under various aspects, and you can choose volition or nolition. So with respect to the vision of hell, that might function as a kind of motive of credibility. Like the person who is proposing to you the life of heaven in showing you the life of hell gives you reason to believe his or her testimony. But that's a different noetic act. It's a reliance upon the testimony of the testator, whereas faith, strictly speaking, leans on the divine truth, right? So it's about the veracity of the thing itself and the God who speaks to it. So I would say that hell, scary, but it's conceivable for me that people would see it and then still slump in that direction. And in part because, you think about the Gospels, plenty of people saw the things that Jesus did of a miraculous sort and turned away because the cost was too significant for them, or because they chose to look away, or because they got distracted or dispersed or what other reason.
But those two last, so for instance, being distracted, that seems not to be their fault. If you're distracted by something.
I think that we're responsible for attention. Yeah.
I can see that to some degree, but also, I mean, if somebody sees Jesus's acts and decides, you said, like, for instance, there's too much cost, surely if they actually apprehended what was really happening in front of them, what was really being offered, then they couldn't think the cost was too high. It wouldn't be in other words, if it is actually the case that the cost is worth paying, that any cost pales in comparison, if that's actually true, then the only way somebody can think the cost is too high is if they're incorrect.
Right.
And it seems unfair to essentially punish someone for something that they're just incorrect about, they're mistaken about.
Yeah, so I think that ignorance, malice, weakness, concupiscence are all culpable insofar as they enter into moral activity and we haven't done what's in our power to address them. And I think that I maybe it's just the case, I think I have a thicker understanding of responsibility while here on earth, and the reason for which is I basically think that there are only two states, heaven and hell, and they overlap on earth. And so here we have a kind of probation period, but then the probation period ends at a certain point with the separation of the soul and the body because we no longer have the means whereby to gather further information upon which to subsequently make judgments and then reason. But like St. Catherine of Siena, for instance, says, all the way to heaven is heaven. Or like C.S. Lewis, I can't remember exactly where, maybe it's in God in the Dock, where he says, you might end in heaven, you might end in hell, but when you look back at your time on earth, you'll recognize it as having been continuous with your present experience. So for those who end in heaven, it will have been heaven on earth. For those who end in hell, it will have been hell on earth. And so my understanding of our agency is, I suspect it's a little thicker than yours, which isn't to say that yours is necessarily wrong. Maybe I'm just naively optimistic.
I don't think it's necessarily wrong in the logical sense, but it's fine to say that you think I'm mistaken. That's that is necessarily the case of disagreement. I find people do this all the time. They they say in conversations like these, they'll say, and not saying that you're sort of wrong or that you're thinking, but it's fine because you kind of have to do that at some point. Otherwise, either I'd be a Catholic or you'd be an atheist, right? And I guess what I'm trying to discover is what the actual
differences
nook of the disagreement is. Perhaps I can ask you in these terms: what do you think explains, if anything? I don't expect you to have an explanation. I just wonder if you can approximate one. What explanation would you propose for the geographical distribution of religious belief?
So my kind of overarching theory is that it corresponds, like God's pedagogy corresponds to our existential and historical state. So I believe, commitment at the outset, that God gives everyone sufficient graces to conversion and eventual justification if those initial graces are profited from. And that's by the natural law, for instance, so like Romans 1 and 2, which, like the baseline understanding for which one need be responsible is an implicit faith in Hebrews 11:6 says basically that God exists and that he rewards those who are faithful to him. And then we typically map that onto a, like an understanding of God and then the dispensation of salvation, so like the triune God and the incarnation. But that it's you are saved by something. You're not saved by the absence of something like invincible ignorance. I'm saved because I wasn't You're not saved by the absence of something. You're saved by something. So I have a pretty thick understanding of like God, the protagonist of salvation, who is in search of all those whom he has fashioned for this precise end. Now, in certain instances, it's thinner, that the appearance of that offer, and in certain instances, it's thicker, which would be like the example that you gave about somebody who receives more direct testimony or more forceful testimony. But in each case, there is testimony present, and that testimony mediates a relationship, the likes of which will draw them unto communion over the course of the life afforded. And that falls within the bounds of God's providence, insofar as God has particular care of all things within the ecosystematic harmony, but care over the common good of them all, not in such a way as to lay them waste as if he were some totalitarian, but in such a way as to draw them unto a good which transcends them and is more widely dispersed than any individual or particular good. And so, on my understanding, like with respect to the geographical distribution, I think that we're seeing the development, as it were, in time and space of the kingdom of God, which subsists primarily in heaven, which kind of spills over onto the surface of the earth, but which here we're only having like a limited experience of, a kind of constrained experience of, insofar as it's only ever meant to flourish in heaven. And so I wouldn't say that it's fair by the standard of human fairness, but I also wouldn't say that the standard of God's pedagogy is a human fairness. It's a glory which surpasses human fairness while not contradicting human fairness.
He's making it more difficult for some than others. I mean,
He's not making it difficult, I wouldn't say.
If I were born, even just to different parents in the United Kingdom, then I could have been born into a different religious culture.
Yeah.
Which makes it more difficult to become a Christian on two grounds. It's not just the philosophical conviction. I mean, bear in mind that all of my teachers, all of my friends, every member of my family is going to have a philosophy that lends itself to a different religious tradition. And somehow, through God's grace, maybe I discover a book in a library and come to realize that, there's this thing called the triune God or something like this. Maybe this happens. That's already an immeasurably more difficult experience than somebody who happens to be born into the correct faith. Also then the social cost, and this is more a problem of evil proper than a problem of divine hiddenness, but that is, it's going to require, firstly, becoming convinced of these propositions, which is going to be very difficult in your social context, and then also the social cost of throwing yourself upon this new interpretation of God's existence. Whereas, if I'm born a few streets down the road, all of this is done away with, and I'm born into the correct understanding. Like, I guess the way that I would think about it is not to say that this precludes the possibility of some, benevolent invigilator of the process. Fine. But what do we expect if there is one God who loves everybody equally, who wants to enter into a relationship with everybody equally? What I would crudely expect is that this religious tradition and this revelation has found its way across the world and has had a sort of similar cultural impact, and that people basically have the same, maybe not the same roots, but no more or less difficulty in coming to know him. And the process is fairly clear and easy to partake in. Maybe not spiritually easy, but practically speaking, an easy thing to do. Straightforward, but not easy, let's say. What would I expect to find if religion is a man-made phenomenon? I'd probably expect that it varies by region, that it reflects its culture, that it suits its culture. that people violently disagree and tend to do so on the grounds of where they come from and their heritage. You know what I mean? Like, basically everything that we observe, I think, is more expected on that worldview. Now, I don't know if you agree with that, but think it's false still, or if you would disagree with that characterization altogether.
I don't know, because I think that would have to fall to the subordinated sciences as to the types of inroads that the gospel has made in particular cultures. Because it strikes me as an operations research problem, which would require like serious programming. And I just don't know if there's an Excel macro for it, because I think that you have to have that determination need be made, by the subordinate sciences, which I think, properly speaking, are sociology and then some kind of whatever it would be, it's like sociology of religion. Like, to what extent do you encounter more in the way of obstacle or hindrance? To what extent do you inquire, or do you observe more in the way of inroad or highway and byway through which the gospel can traverse a culture? And I think there are places in which the gospel is less present, or where Christian believers are fewer in number. But then, like, how do you measure the social impact of the few who are present there? Or how do you measure the transformation that it works in the intermediate institutions, for which they're present or in which they take part? Because like in some places, like profession of an alien creed is punishable by death, right? So that's a strong motivating factor. And you see in a very acute way the familial, social, political costs of taking that step. And yet some people do and some people don't, which I think reflects the ambivalence of human volition before an offer which, though compelling, is not going to overrun or override the human element.
Let's think about it again in the context of free will, in that when people convert, C.S. Lewis writes that when a Christian becomes an atheist in like university or something, it's very rarely because they've heard some kind of argument. It's because, their friends want to go out and they want to go drinking and they want to engage in casual sex, and it's more of a sort of cultural thing. You just sort of, who you are, what is it? Show me the friends and I'll show you the man, something like that going on. I think this is true in both directions. And it is also true in a philosophical sense, in that if somebody has converted to Christianity from atheism, a lot of the time it's because they've met somebody who's talked them through it, who's answered their objections and shown them to church. Maybe, that they've I don't know, you can imagine the Christian films in which somebody saves the choking child from dying and then invites them to church or something. I think that's the plot of at least one of these films. Okay, this isn't too far off what actually happens in a lot of cases. And it happens in the reverse. You have Christians who go to university, meet a bunch of atheists, and and it may be totally sort of irrational, but they're talked out of it somehow. Now, that means that there are certain Christians alive today who now have the correct doctrine and the correct practices, and they're probably going to go to heaven because they met somebody who introduced them to the faith. Because that person sort of was scrolling through the universities, didn't really have an idea of where to apply, and then thought that, Liverpool University, that's got a nice library. I quite like the look of the ceiling, so maybe I'll apply there. And that arbitrary, trivial choice is the reason why this person is now going to heaven. If free will exists in the sense that I understand that you think it does, this person could have preferred a different ceiling of a library and therefore excluded this now stranger from eternal life. I just sort of, it seems a bit like a comedy to me, like it seems like it seems like almost entertaining to think, if that's the case, how precariously it's all balanced upon such a sometimes. I mean, I've given a purposefully ludicrous example here, but that kind of thing does happen, like small decisions like that can have large effects down the road. The butterfly flapping its wings. If this is the case, like, I don't know. I think it captures an emotion that doesn't do well in a syllogism. But I think you understand the kind of feeling I'm getting at, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just feels weird. It feels really very strange. Again, if we think of religion as man-made, this is not a problem. it sort of dissipates. This is the kind of thing I think does need, explaining and addressing. And some people like to say, well, look, God's hand is in it. Like, God's hand is in the fact that this person, preferred this university and chose this university and met this person. But then we basically just become determinists, and we've removed the whole freedom of will thing that this whole thing is predicated upon, at least in this instance. It's like, oh yeah, you were free to do basically anything you wanted in your life, except the university choice. Except, God knew that it was going to be the color of the ceiling that made you make the decision, so he made you born with a predisposition towards orange or something. Yeah, maybe, but that just sort of undermines the idea that this was a free action altogether. And if that's the case, then no longer do you have recourse to the idea that the reason why some people believe and some people don't is through their own volition. Because as long as God, in one case, has his hand in making this person convert by introducing him to this person at university, by making this person choose that university, then we have to explain why he hasn't done that in other cases. Why nobody chose my university who talked to me in such a way as to convert me to Christianity. You know what I mean? So, yeah, doesn't it seem a bit arbitrary, in other words?
It does. And I think that what you described is one way of covering the phenomenon, with some modicum of probability, probability being the probity attaching to an opinion. And I think that, with respect to God's hand is in it, I think if God's hand were only in that discrete act, then the argument may obtain. But the typical Catholic teaching is that at every moment of every day, there's something like that our way is literally strewn with those events. And perhaps it's not yet the time, or perhaps we're posing obstacles to it. But the commanding image for the influx of the life of grace in a soul is that of sun through a window, and that the way in which human volition is typically expressed in those who reject it is just like shuttering the windows or permitting the windows to dirty by a kind of natural inertia. And that makes appeal to a prior principle, which opens further problems and probably is worth bracketing insofar as it just takes us down a difficult series of inquiries. But that this is not God's original intention for the universe, and that God created our first parents in a state of grace is the Christian teaching, and that they freely chose against it, and that God is not culpable for our fact of inheriting a compromised human nature, but it's that our human nature was fortified. And the Thomistic teaching is that you refer to this state of original justice or rectitude, whereby our minds were subordinated to God in grace, our lower powers to our higher powers by a kind of integral nature, and then our bodies to our souls, which would have radiated as a kind of immortality, impassibility, all things besides. In choosing against the divine command, Adam and Eve, our first parents, lose the life of grace insofar as grace is only ever had, kind of in this ambiance of the gift, and then they lose the other things associated with it, such that our different powers of the soul, depending on which type of anthropology one espouses, but basically like our intellectual and volitional and then our kind of emotional, as it were, engagement with the world is now no longer ordered as it was previously. So now we can have more in the way of interference or more in the way of dissonance, and we can supplant the higher good with the lower good, and this becomes infinitely complicated insofar as now there's a lot of noetic static, there's a lot of kind of affective junk. There's just a lot more to it than there was previously. But God, in reorchestrating, as it were, the providence that issues from this fell choice, still finds ways by which, it sounds as if like God is excogitating ways, but God posits, as it were, into the void, ways by which to come back. And so then seeing our way as strewn with, again, ways by which to come back represents a yet more ponderous mercy because it's premised on our initial rejection of the gift. And you might say, doesn't seem like we're responsible for that, but it's like our nature has been left to itself when it was originally intended not to be. I think that that's, like original sin being the privation of rectitude.
Do you believe in the fool as in any way a literal historical account?
In some way, yeah.
What's your sort of understanding of what the fool is or was?
Yeah, so
I don't mean in terms of its sort of moral implication. Yeah, I just mean as a historical event.
Yeah, sure. So it seems like based on the, paleontological or the fossil record, just based on the genetic evidence that we have in the current breeding population, and then the strong testimony for an out of Africa theory, it seems like those breeding pairs only ever bottleneck down to 6,000, 7,000. So there's a pretty large population. So accounting for a sin for which a person is responsible within a large breeding population, that there is difficult to wrap your head around. And I've seen different theories proposed as to it, but it's not settled church doctrine. I think that you can say that there's a kind of evolutionary story whereby we come to our present biological state of Homo sapiens, but you don't necessarily have our, as it were, philosophical state of Homo sapiens until such time as a rational soul is infused, not as an emergent property, but in the Christian understanding as a direct intervention of God. That there would have been evolutionary steps in order for that rational soul to have free exercise given the corporeal organs involved, but that there might have been an infusion of a rational soul in an original breeding pair, and that it would have bred out all subsequent generations such that, you know, those who came in turn also had rational souls, that being kind of vouchsafed to them in their initial infusion.
Sure. I've been speaking for the past, how many days it's been, about a week or so, with a lot of different Catholics about the doctrine of original sin. It keeps coming up.
Okay.
And I have a number of questions that I've been given a number of answers to over the past few days, and I'm interested in seeing what you think of it all. Original sin, what do you think happens here? So we've got this sort of, you know, first human of some sort, you know, however they came to be, but we've got a rational animal. We've got a Homo sapiens, and they have consciousness, they have awareness, all this kind of stuff. They have freedom, and then they do something, and now something is transmitted to the human species. What is it that they do, even if you don't know the specifics? What's the kind of thing that happens?
Yeah.
And what is it that's now transmitted to the rest of us because of it?
Right. I'm just Mystic Hack, so I'm just going to repeat things. So I think that their being originally created in this state of rectitude or original justice means that they have these gifts just outlined: grace, integral nature, and then impassibility, immortality. I think that the enjoyment of that state is contingent upon the recognition and reception of it as a gift at some level. How that registers emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, I don't know, but it has to be recognized as from another and unto another. I think that the original sin is basically rejection of that gratuity. It's a rejection of the gift nature. So it would be either like we want ourselves for the end, or we want ourselves for the end on our own steam, or maybe we want you, but again, on our own steam. We won't have it by the grace, which is the only sufficient principle to attain unto life eternal. And so Chesterton has a cool meditation upon that in Orthodoxy, actually. And he actually hints at the arbitrarity of it. But like he saves the arbitrarity in couching it personalistically. It's about the relationship. It's like, you have to trust me. And then how is it that the evil one kind of makes inroads? Well, he convinces them that they don't have what they in fact have. You know, he said that. He couldn't possibly have said that. You know, you'll be like gods if you partake. Well, here's the thing. That's the Christian doctrine of grace. Namely that grace is the seed, as it were, of glory. So it's the progressive divinization which ought to take place over the course of a human life is at work in the life of grace. So they already are like gods in a certain sense. And Satan convinces them, as it were, that they aren't what they in fact are. And then in believing him, they come to inherit, you know, the fell harvest thereof. So I think that basically it's a kind of loving obedience which is asked of them in light of this gift. They reject the gift nature of the initial offering, and then they wound this loving obedience. And then what happens is these original things with which they were blessed, you know, they pass away. So they lose grace, they lose integral nature, and they lose, you know, immortality and impassibility. But those things aren't due by nature. So I don't think that, I mean, St. Thomas doesn't think that human nature fundamentally changes, because there has to be continuity between the nature of the original pair and the nature at present, because that's the logic of Romans 5. Like, if we don't have a solidarity in Adam, then we don't have a solidarity in the salvation which goes by way of him.
Yeah. So what is it that you think is different about us now on account of the fall, in other words?
Yeah, so we're not born into this world with grace, right? So we need to be healed and grown beyond certain effects, like effects of thought, effects of choice, effects of feeling, which register in our humanity quite vehemently. I think one of the ways in which we see it principally is, okay, so intellect, will, and passions, each ordered to their proper good. There are a variety of things that attract me. I want to, you know, perdure in existence. I'm ordered to the procreation and education of children, even though I'm in a celibate state. That's part of my nature, right? I want to know the truth about God. I want to live peaceably in society. I want to do all kinds of things, but I don't see clearly how that hierarchy ought to be established. I don't see clearly how lower goods ought to be nested under higher goods, and then how I ought to comport myself vis-a-vis those goods. And I think that's why you have the kind of powder keg, which is what we would call like concupiscence, or like the kindling of sin. In that the lower things, they usually pertain to what is more instinctual, like food, drink, sexual intercourse, like things that concern us very urgently and immediately for the handing on of life, whether our own or that of subsequent generations. And so the way that they're tinged makes it so that we have a harder time thinking clearly about them because we just see it as shiny or sexy or whatever else. And so that can detract us.
I suppose my question is that if Adam and Eve didn't already have something of this nature, then how is it that they were so prone to sinning in the first place? That is, if I'm often told that sometimes the reason why evil exists is because we live in a fallen world. That can't quite be true because there's evil in the garden in the form of the serpent, right? There's something about us now which makes us more prone to sinning, makes us more sort of broken creatures, but somehow in a way that wasn't already broken enough to cause the sin in the first place. Like, if what it is that we have some kind of even more depraved nature than was already there, it must have already been pretty depraved for that decision to be made, and at the first opportunity, and at not very much convincing from the serpent, and in a way that involved deception. It's not like Eve was knowingly sinning. I mean, she knew that God had told her not to do another thing, but not to do this particular thing. But from the perspective of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, it seems like God is just like another character in the story. God says, if you eat of this tree, well, he says, don't eat of this tree, for you shall surely die. And Adam and Eve are sort of like, cool, all right. And then the serpent comes along and says, that's not true, right? And Eve's like, oh, isn't it? And she looks at the tree and it looks fine. She's like, oh, okay, well, then I guess I'll go and eat it. In other words, it doesn't sound like somebody sinning. It doesn't sound like this dramatic language I often hear of, well, she sort of put her own desire above that of God. I don't know if she was sort of doing that. I think she was, and in fact, she was deceived in the story. It's a deception. It's not her fault. And in fact, the very thing that she's doing is eating from the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which I see as sort of an allegory for something like moral knowledge, moral awareness, represented also in the fact that they then realize that they're naked. Like, if this sin was committed in a condition where there's no moral knowledge, then how can somebody be held morally culpable for the decision that they make? How can it be that Eve was knowingly doing something evil when what she was doing was eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, implying that she didn't have that knowledge yet? And if she didn't, then she's being essentially punished for something that she didn't knowingly do and did because somebody else deceived her into doing so, because she already had a nature that was prone enough to sin that at a singular poke from the serpent, she acts in this particular way. And she's deceived. I struggle to see this as her fault. Then, on account of this, we today are dealing with the consequences of this in a way that people are often reluctant to see as a form of punishment, but consider it punishment in the poetic sense that we are now suffering on account of it. I mean, Eve is told that her pains in childbirth will be multiplied greatly. Adam is told that the toil is now going to be the way that you make your living, and their descendants also have to suffer with this, implying that the reason that women suffer in childbirth today, to the extent that they do, is not just as a punishment for a sin that they didn't commit, but as a punishment for a sin that the person who did commit it didn't even do so knowingly. This seems egregious to me, not to mention the fact that even the snake is, told that it will run around on its belly for the rest of its life because of its sort of role, implying some kind of answer maybe to like snake suffering. We've got like inheritable moral responsibility for these irrational creatures, Now, this only really applies if you take the story literally, but I guess what I'm asking is, what on earth is this supposed to represent that isn't... I know I've sort of painted it as quite morally egregious, and maybe I've been a bit uncharitable, but that is how it seems to me.
Yeah. So I take the stance that Genesis 1 through 11 are largely operating in a mythopoeic genre, and that they're consciously adapting stories of the ancient Near East with an intent to show by transposition how the God of Israel is distinct from other, Canaanite warring gods, and that the notes which are introduced into it are one, like divine goodness, that the source of evil isn't the heavens and the way in which you see it in like the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that God's intent for us is also good, and that we are free in our choice. It's a free rejection for which we're responsible in some way, shape, or form, and that the temptation is against a kind of loving obedience, and that the sin is a choice for a kind of autonomy, like the knowledge of good and evil being a kind of self-determination. As to the particular details, like, there's a literal sense of the text. I don't know, like I kind of look to subsequent clarifications as guidelines for how to pin that down insofar as one can. But like when it comes to the doctrine of original sin, that's, you wait centuries in the Christian tradition before that's enunciated very clearly with like Augustine. And it's largely in light of Romans 5 that you have the interpretation of Genesis 3. But I would say like, yeah, for prima facie, the story is strange. It seems like if this original state was so good, for instance, why did it only last 5 verses? Like, why did they prove themselves so fragile? So one thing I would say is to introduce is that the rebellion had already begun. It had begun among the angels, right? So that the angelic fall would antecede the human fall. And so you see the kind of communal dimension of rebellion against God. And so co-responsibility is a feature of this account. And so I think that I'm probably going to end up relying more on individual human responsibility and on communal human responsibility and angelic responsibility. So I think that probably comes down to the nub is a sense of responsibility.
I don't know when it's coming out. I don't know when this conversation is coming out, but I'm currently working on a response to a certain Mr. Ken Ham, who responded to this speech that I gave and does so. It's about the problem of evil, and he gives an account of evil as explained by the fall. And he believes that Genesis is a literal historical account, so it's slightly different. But an example that an example I give in this video is I'm sort of imagining something like I'm your landlord and you're renting a flat from me, and I like shut off your heating and I install 1,000 locks to make it impossible for you to get into your home. It takes, hours. And, I periodically switch off your electricity just for the fun of it. And you say, look, why are you doing this to me? Why are you torturing me like this? And I say, well, don't you know that your great-grandfather once rented this flat from me, and he wronged me. And look, I'm not going to say that I'm punishing you for something. A natural consequence. I mean, I gave him a contract. I said, look, don't do this thing. And maybe it's something like I said, hey, don't turn off the oven, by the wall. I don't even say why. Maybe I say, because it's going to do something very bad, or you'll burn the house down. And then somebody came along, and maybe it's sort of an electrician friend who looks at it and says, I don't know what your landlord's talking about. Like, this switch isn't even like connected to the wall as far as I can see. Like, it's going to be absolutely fine. So he flicks the switch. And that's why I'm punishing you. That's why I've shut off your electricity and your heating and installed 1,000 locks. I'm sorry? Like, what am I supposed to take from this other than the I think intolerable notion of inheritable guilt, inheritable moral responsibility by genus, which is the origin of a great many hateful doctrines throughout the history of mankind, that somehow your moral position, and worse, your moral guilt, your blameworthiness, is inheritable from the sins of your father. And here we're talking about a sin that your grandfather didn't even really commit. He was sort of deceived into doing so. This to me seems somewhat analogous to the story that you're giving me of the fool. And I think that if I were doing that, I should be arrested, thrown in jail, or at the very least, reproached by my fellow human beings.
Yeah, so I think how I would adjust the story that you told is that it would have been more along the lines of, like, we were made to live in a palace, but we questioned God's intent in putting us in the palace. Like, are you manipulating us? Are you controlling us? And he's like, you don't have to live in the palace. And then we chose to live in a hovel. And he said, you can live in the hovel. And so I think that we were given something beyond what we merit. I mean, there's no antecedent merits on account of the fact that we're talking about creation. but we were giving something far beyond what might be said to be fair or just, and then we chose against it. My sense for how we are virtually present in the choice of Adam, that is a difficult question.
That's the question.
That's a huge question.
I don't want to interrupt, but there are certain words that I want to sort of jump in, like when you just said, we chose not to live in it. Did we? I didn't. I don't remember making that decision. And in fact, I think if I had the decision now, I know what I would take. And that applies analogously too. I'd rather live in a state of grace in a nice garden that's almost perfect, except for the inexplicable existence of some evil serpent that's been allowed within the paradise, the walled garden. I'd much rather that. But because somebody who dubiously is said to be my sort of great grandfather made a decision on account of being convinced by his girlfriend, on account, respectively, of being deceived by an evil serpent who had no business being in the Garden of Eden in the first place. Yeah, you're quite right. That is the question. Even if you are present in that, though, even if you are present in that decision, there still seems to be a sort of lack of culpability, as far as I can see. Even if somehow there's part of me present in the decision that Adam made. What was the decision he made? To listen to his wife? Or his girl? I guess they hadn't been married. I guess they were sort of married in a sense, automatically married, an arranged marriage, if you like. And she says, hey, eat this apple. And he goes, fine. And why does she do that? Because some serpent told her not just eat the apple, but that she was being lied to about the nature of the fruit. We don't know if it was an apple, and it's obviously not literally a fruit, but you see what I'm saying. It's deception. I find it difficult to hold even them morally culpable for this, let alone us.
So I would say that our reading of that passage, so we're talking about a passage written well after the fact, who knows, when the fact transpired, but well after the fact insofar as it's written sometime between the 10th and the 7th century BC, and as the reflection of a religious people on their religious history whereby to account for their present religious experience, inspired by God, right? So the primary author in the Christian understanding is God. He works through the inspired author, somewhere in between a trance and subsequent approbation. We don't exactly know how that works. That hasn't been pronounced upon, but you can reason within bounds on the particular matter. But I'm not especially wed to those details in the sense that, I think that there's a literal sense to the text, but I think that the literalistic sense of the text does violence to what's being communicated. And I think that the redaction history by comparison to ancient Near Eastern myths it yields far more in the way that it emphasizes the principal doctrines which are at stake. Goodness, God's goodness, our essential goodness, the culpability of our choice, the responsibility for which, and then how it transpires. So I think that, whether, like a serpent or something, it's just I just say the evil one, in the sense that as a Christian interpretation of an Old Testament text, which pertains, first to the Hebrews and then is adopted by the church as the new Israel, we can talk about it in those terms, reading it within the context of the tradition. So I'm making certain hermeneutical leaps, which I realize leave me exposed, but ... But in this particular case, so the ways that St. Thomas describes our virtual presence in the choice of Adam is he says that we're present in Adam's choice. Adam is the best among us, equipped more than any of us with the means whereby to make the right choice. That we're present in Adam's nature, and that we're present in Adam's loins. So the last, with respect to, let's go back from 3 to 1, and then I'll just stop. So he communicates to us a human nature, all right, and we, he makes, our father makes a genetic contribution, our mother makes a genetic contribution. We inherit a nature in concert with theirs. But we don't inherit something super added to that nature, as if original sin were a parasitic Chrome extension, that you just slotted in there. It's not. So when we're speaking about original sin, we're talking about human nature being left to itself. So we were originally intended to operate in an ambiance of utter and sheer gratuity. We chose against it because we didn't abide the terms of that concession. And now we're left to ourselves because we said we want to be left to ourselves. And one might ask, is it appropriate for God to even make a creature who has such sovereignty over his life whereby he can dictate the terms of his own damnation? That's a great question. And I think that brings us back to the best possible world question, because God could have made us rocks, or he could have made us plants, or he could have made us animals, or he could have made us angels, but he made us this. And he made us this in a certain sense unto glory, without in the Christian belief, making of us thereby pawns in the displaying of some cosmic point, so that he could get together with, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and say, like, that went weird. But rather simply to say, like, for glory, right? From start to finish within the context of a divine wisdom, which is provident and sees to everything in its particularity unto a communal expression. So I think present in Adam's loins, right? So the human nature is created left to itself, and that brings us to the nature, that we're not due that by right, but that we have a kind of nostalgia for the grace in which we were created, which orients us by way of openness or by way of like lamentation and anger to the reintroduction of the life of grace, which then situates us squarely within a salvation history, which Christ comes at the culmination of which, so you can kind of like lead up to it and then unpack it, would be like the typical Christian teaching. And then, like present in Adam as the greatest among us. So like it's a Christian teaching, it's not pronounced upon, but that like Adam would have had all virtues in a way that would have been like fontal. So as the first among us, he, like the perfect pre-contains what issues from it, so that he would have had these things. So even though we might say to ourselves, if I'd had the choice, maybe I'd have chosen differently, we probably wouldn't, but we still want to be able to exercise that choice. And the fact is, in the historical dispensation, we can exercise that choice. Because these gifts that we lost, grace, integral nature, immortality, and immutability, they all await us as an eschatological realization. So like grace can be reconstituted in baptism. Integral nature, that's just like the transformation wrought by the life of virtue in the Christian understanding, is that intellect, will, and passions are once again reoriented such that the hierarchy of creation becomes pellucid to the individual reasoner and he's reconciled to them. And then impassibility and immortality, that's the resurrection at the end of the age. So it places us within a dramatic arc. Mind you, it's tough, but it's not for fairness, it's unto glory. I mean, like the beginning of an answer.
Well, I would think that I would do the same thing in Adam's position, or indeed Eve's position. But the reason for that is because I think that they were deceived. Now, it seems to me strange that not only can they be judged for this, but we can too. If I asked you to say happy birthday in Spanish to my Spanish cousin, and I showed you a translation, and it actually was like blasphemy, and I got you to read it out, and then I said, "Ha! You've just blasphemed, and you're a sinner now." Like, I think you'd probably be within your rights to say, well, look, I'd rather you hadn't done that, but I'm not going to hold myself morally culpable for doing something that you've just tricked me into doing, and I don't think God is either. But this is kind of how the story reads to me. If the account is accurate that there was deception by the evil one, what you have is essentially the serpent coming up to Eve and saying, hey, read this, it says happy birthday, and she reads it out, and what it actually says is, some curse of God. I'm not going to invent the words into the actual microphone, given the sanctity of the space. And then God saying, well, you've done it now. For you and your progeny, for the rest of time, you're going to suffer on account of what you've just done. It seems like perhaps a bit of an overreaction and an unfair one. So in other words, yeah, I would have done what Adam did. And I do have problems with the idea that I am present in his sin, but I'm willing to just grant that and say, sure, imagine it were me. Imagine I am Adam. I'm the person who actually did the thing itself. If I was deceived into doing so by the most intelligent and devious evil mind in the history of everything, I don't think that would be a sound basis on which to condemn me, let alone my children and my children's children and my children's children's children.
So one thought is just with respect to the example, I think that there's a moral dimension both to the act and to the trust which informs the act. So there's an interpersonal context. It's not just a matter of me robotically reading words. So one, I'm a priest and I live in the United States, and half of the Catholics in the United States speak Spanish. So I have something of a responsibility to know Spanish. I don't know how much that responsibility weighs on me, but enough for me to learn Spanish. And so I see it, I know it's not happy birthday, and then I do it. Obviously, you can change the example. But also, there's this, the interpersonal dimension. So I am making a judgment about a person, so about the credibility of that person. And I think the point about the temptation which was posed to them was that it was directly meant to undermine their credibility vis-a-vis their source and end, so like vis-a-vis the personal God. So faith leans on the divine veracity. Truth himself speaks truly, else there's nothing true. That's the basic idea. It's like I believe because he says, now mind you, if something like that were offered to another human being, it would represent a kind of violence. It's the type of thing that only obtains for God insofar as he is the truth, subsisting truth, and thus cannot contradict himself in how he, interacts with creation. Interacts is a crass word. I take it back. And how he operates. And so, like, all of our kind of created examples of that type of fiduciary trust are limited, and we know ourselves to be exposed to potential deception, right, or to potential manipulation. But the nature of this temptation was that it was posed as contradictory to that most basic relationship. And so, regardless of what the choice was, I don't know what the choice was, whether it concerned fruit or otherwise, like whether there was a serpent involved, it just doesn't matter too terribly much to me. But that this is called into question by something that obtains on a very low grade order by comparison to the metaphysical thickness of your very lifeblood in the order of nature and of grace. And so, yeah, I suppose in light of that, it's the type of thing for which, the fallout that comes in turn is terrible. It is terrible. And if that were the final word, I would think it terrible. Or I don't know that I would have the kind of intellectual wherewithal to even think myself through it because whatever, doesn't matter. But I think that there's a kind of Augustinian dictum. God permits evil to befall only in bringing from it some good. I try not to make the optimize, maximize argument for that. Bring about a greater good as if God relied upon evil in order to generate good, which I think is creepy. But this sense that he permits evil and from the midst thereof, we see good arise. And so I personally, I think by virtue of faith commitment, so this is just being more generally Christian claim, I just don't know how fruitful it is to consider this question. Do I want to say that? At a certain point, I think this question has to be posed at the foot of the cross without being too preachy. But I'm a preacher, so there it is. I only think it makes sense in light of the solution which God proposes to it. And it's not a solution in the way in which, math solutions are rendered to knotty problems. It's I think that our human questioning about the nature of suffering only begins to make sense insofar as we become a partaker in Christ's. It's not something that he answers once and for all. It's not something that he answers in the abstract. It's something that he opens himself up to. He makes himself vulnerable so that we can find a home therein. And I realize that makes it sound, like some theologians will say, like a bloody massacre. And yet, here we are.
And here we are, and running out of time. For this conversation, not sort of in the grander sense that you refer to. But I think there's one more topic that our producer would like us to cover. I don't know how you want us to. I don't know if you want us to cut this out or.
No, I'll just shout it out here. So, I would like to know, Alex, what seeking for you has looked like. Is it just, in one sense, it could just be listening to a bunch of arguments and thinking about these conceptions of God. So what has seeking looked like? How have you sought and not found? And then related to that, have you grown in your conception of God? Or are there conceptions of God? You seem to be averse to a conception of God like this flying spaghetti monster, right? And that's kind of a silly way to characterize God. So have you moved at all towards a conception of God? Is it reasonable at all? So does that make sense, those two questions together?
Yeah, for the benefit of the tape, the question is what seeking has looked like for me. And it's difficult to judge the sincerity of your own actions sometimes, but and what I mean is that the motivations are difficult to ascertain. You can say all you like that I'm going into this conversation to speak with Father Gregory Pine because I want to advance my understanding of Catholicism and come to maybe, but it may be secretly and unbeknownst to even me, really what I want is, to get a cool bit of content where, priest gets owned by atheists. I like to think that's not what's going on. But you know what I mean? There can be subconscious motivations. But what I do know is that I have a degree in theology. And it's again difficult to know the motivations for doing that. I really wanted to study philosophy, but at my university they wouldn't let me do that on its own, and I decided that a good mixture would be philosophy and theology. I thought I'd get to learn a lot, but also, I'm making YouTube videos at the time from an atheist perspective. So there's a part of me which thinks, yeah, I'll get to know my enemy and be better at sort of deconstructing it. And it just so happened that I actually ended up really enjoying it and learning a lot, and my view of the philosophy of religion changed quite a bit. But what I'm saying is the motivations get a bit blurry. But I know that I studied for a degree in theology, and so at the very least I have some interaction with the literature, with the arguments, and with some wonderful people. I know that I semi-regularly attend church services in various contexts. While in Nashville, I went with Mass of the Ages to a traditional Latin Mass. I've done the same thing in Oxford on the invitation of some Catholic friends, but I also go along with another friend who is sort of not a Christian, I think, maybe like an agnostic. I think he believes in God, I'm not sure. But we like to go to churches in England that we think are beautiful, and we like listening to some of the choral services because we think they're nice. But then you do find yourself in a church environment listening to readings as well. I know that I've spent more time than not atheist colleagues of mine, that is like people who do this kind of thing, but average atheists, more time than most atheists would spend looking at the philosophy of religion, looking at the Bible, looking at, more recently I've been interested in like biblical scholarship. Beforehand it was a philosophical enterprise, but as of late I've been looking at the historical Jesus and the reliability of the Gospels and the which letters were actually written by Paul and what it means for epistles written by some specific man to specific communities to be scripture, this kind of thing. In other words, I'm sort of looking all over the place. I'm performing actions like going to church or attempting to pray or allowing friends around me to pray for me, even though I find it quite cringe-making. I try to do so in a way that isn't disrespectful. I mean, like, when I was in Latin Mass the other day, everybody stands up and I stand up because, it's what you do. It's polite. Sit down, I sit down. Everybody kneels and I don't kneel. Not out of some kind of arrogance, but out of a sense that it feels rude or disrespectful to essentially be playing pretend. It would feel like going up and taking communion for me. It would just feel wrong to do. So there is a limit to this, but like I've spent a long time doing this now, and maybe I'm doing it incorrectly. And I feel like I was doing it incorrectly for the first few years because I was doing this sort of edgy new atheist thing. And I didn't realize that at the time, really. I probably would have known somewhere that that's what I was doing. Maybe I'm doing something similar now, that in 5-10 years I'll look back and think, you had no idea, you were going totally wrong. But the fact that I'm finding that even difficult to ascertain is reason enough for me to think that there's a problem in the fact that after so much knocking that my fingers are beginning to bruise, I'm not even hearing a wince from the other side.
Yeah. I mean, what do I think? Yeah, I wouldn't want to cheapen your experience or speak in a way that was overgeneral or, unhelpful. I'm thinking about, this is a situation which is different from your own, but there are certain parallels. I was talking to a woman who was raised Catholic, but had fallen away from the practice of the faith, and we had some exchanges on points pertinent to theology and sacramental practice and things like that. And then she wanted to bring her husband along for another meeting, and I was like, sure, that'd be great. And then her husband, in our second meeting, I'd afforded maybe like an hour and 50 minutes for the meeting. Her husband kind of lectured me as to why things that I had said in my conversation with her were not sufficiently nuanced or not sufficiently well crafted as to obtain in the particular time and place. Specifically, it concerned cultural or ethnic limitations to my proposals. And which was really difficult for me because I am arrogant. And it's just difficult for me, like when I feel lorded over. And so I was like doing my best because like sometimes I can get in a mode where I just permit somebody else to harangue me, because I know that in permitting them to speak at great length, then I can hang them with the rope that they have just stretched out. But this went on for like an hour and 10 minutes. And the last word that he said was like, so don't scratch the surface because you don't know what you'll find beneath. And I think it was like an indication of, like don't scratch the surface of our kind of current cultural ethnic expression of piety, which doesn't comport with your own sensibilities, because you don't know what you'll find with underneath. And I suppose I was feeling irascible, and I was also just like, I was just kind of sad. And I said, yeah, like I don't know what to do but to scratch. And that's not because, because I get like YouTube kickbacks from, like revenue generated thereby, but because like I only have one mode. And I wonder, honestly, sometimes whether that one mode is a deterministic fact, because I was born to these parents in this town, attended this parish, received these sacraments, was given this type of education and formation. But like my experience of it is something organic, in the sense that it's like life. And I probably reason somewhat irresponsibly insofar as a theologian, I often like go for something beautiful, and then I happen upon the fact that it may in fact be true. It's like this links up and that links up, and you know what? That might correspond to reality. So I get ahead of myself. But I think that, in light of the fact that because of, who I am and the pertinent factors which contributed to that, I have a certain tendency, which is to continue to ask questions, and that I also have a certain tendency, I don't know exactly how to describe it best. Maybe I should just lapse that particular point off into silence. But I think that, not to make of this a kind of armchair philosopher point, but I think that the questioning itself is not obviously it's not worthless. In your particular case, it has a particular expression. But I'm thinking of like Job, okay? So like the book of Job. So Job and his interlocutors ask questions for the better part of 38 chapters, and then God shows up and asks more questions, which is kind of devastating. Because I think like at a certain level, we want a response. Like we don't want God to be, like an armchair philosopher, or like a kind of cute psychologist who's like, well, what do you think about that? Or like a lawyer who repeats back to us the last question that we formulated as part of our testimony. Like we want a solution. But I think that part of it, and maybe a central conviction for me, is that we are made like capable, or we're made capacious for the solution only progressively. And so we get like indications, small hints of a solution, but that part of the whole discourse is growing the capacity or growing the capability to recognize and receive the solution as it's meted out in time and space in the pertinent circumstances. And so when God shows up on the scene and he says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? It's like, ask deeper questions. It's not that like the questions are bad. I'm not saying let's shut down the discourse. I'm saying ask deeper questions. Perhaps it's naive to think that questions asked deeply or honestly will always lead to a terminus, but I think I might be committed to that by revelation. So, that's a mix, and a muddled mix, but the mix that I have.
Well, it's a shame we don't have time for an entire discussion on the Book of Job. Something I've been meaning to make a sort of atheist review of for a very long time. I thought it would be interesting to do sort of book reviews of certain biblical texts or stories, beginning with the Book of Job, because it's like the atheist's favorite text, except for maybe Ecclesiastes, but that's coming next. Because it's sort of the one where, God is the bad guy, and he inflicts suffering for the sake of a bet, and then tells the audience why he's doing it. But when Job asks why he's doing it, he essentially says, well, you could never hope to understand. And actually, how dare you for even thinking that you're the kind of person who should be able to ask? And I like to think if the story is taken metaphorically, it's maybe not quite as straightforward as that. And so it's something I want to explore, although it does seem troubling to me that is like an indication, is that there is a reason. And it's not just that, it's not, look, Job, I'm really sorry. I just can't find the means to explain this to you. I don't think you'll ever be able to understand, but, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Like, who the hell are you? What are you playing at? Why would you think you even deserve an answer? It seems out of accord with the loving and compassionate nature of God that undergirds discussions about him in the abstract, in other words. But like I say, I wish we had more time to discuss that. I don't want that to be the final word, because you might have something to say on what I've just said there. It seems unfair to throw that out and not allow you to respond. But yeah, it's just I don't know. It's a confusing story. I think a confusing narrative on many accounts.
Yeah, I suppose by way of a short final word, I might say, in reading the scriptures canonically, the Old Testament in light of the New, I think often of how our Lord adduces questions from the hearts of those with whom he's in conversation, especially like in the Gospel of John, and how some of his most sublime revelations are immediately attendant upon a question that he has provoked. Like Philip in John 14, like, show us the Father and that will be enough. And he's like, you don't get it. Like, have you been with me this long and still you do not know? Like, he who has seen me has seen the Father. And I think like part of that dialogical kind of back and forth is meant in this vein, like to kind of make capable, make capacious for the grandeur or the glory. I mean, that's kind of what we started with. So maybe it's appropriate to end with that, which lies in store. But we need to be made capable and capacious of it. And I think of, what was it, Leon Bloy, who said, there are places in the heart that do not exist until such time as suffering enters in. And I think that's, like to speak of it in cute terms or in precious terms it's inappropriate, because it doesn't do due reverence to the way in which people genuinely suffer and the way in which that's life destroying, soul destroying, body destroying. But that there is a vantage from which one can see how it might be part of a bigger story.
Well, Father Pine, thanks so much for sitting down with me for this conversation. It's been wide ranging and hopefully edifying to the listener.
Cheers.
As well as to me.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.